You want to hit this?
Let's hit it.
All right. I want to talk about our, I should say my picks because I know you're going to weigh in on them, but my picks for Street Fighter 6's launch roster.
Ooh.
And you could say, okay, a little bit premature here, but you know what? This game is coming up. We know it's coming up. I'm pretty sure it's going to be called Street Fighter 6. I know this stuff is going on. The first two characters are going to be Ryu and Chun-Li because Capcom has outright told us that they're going to be in every single Street Fighter game. So that's the easiest place to start.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Ken has been on all of the launch rosters in the entire history of the franchise. So he's really easy to include. It's like, I can't see Ken not being there. From there, you can start to take a few steps down in terms of how much of a lock people are. And we're going to kind of go into descending order in terms of who's most likely to least likely. So those three are pretty much locks. From there, it gets a little bit, more dicey, but as you just spoke about, Luke, Capcom has said he's a big part of that Street Fighter's future. I don't see how you could not include him on the base roster if that's the case. I mean, maybe he's DLC, but it's like if he's tied into the core gameplay, he's got to be there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's also good to mention here that gameplay styles are a factor with launch rosters. Characters like Ryu and Chun-Li are often traditionally mid-range zoning characters. Ken is usually rushdown, and by the looks of him, my guess is that Luke is going to be a rushdown style character too. I think he's in rushdown is like what is popular right now in fighting games. You can look at all the character archetypes, and like by far, people play rushdown characters more than anyone else in these games, and that's fine. Flashy, big offense. There you go, right?
Yeah.
So the next character I've got up is a grappler, and if you're going to pick a grappler, you're probably going to pick the most iconic one, and that is Zangief. He was not on the Alpha or Street Fighter 3 launch rosters, but he was available from the get-go for Street Fighter 4 and 5, and the latter Alpha games put him in there. He's a super high-end candidate. And then long-range zoners are also fairly uncommon, and that role is typically very much occupied by Dhalsim, who has basically the same track record as Zangief does for appearances on launch roster, which is pretty solid overall. Like overall, it's rare to have those characters not be in there.
Yeah, and I also especially with Zangief and Dhalsim, they are very specific archetypes which are interesting and unique, but also not for everyone. And I would almost,
Right.
I think I'd put Honda in here as well, which will actually kind of end up being the sort of counter to what I'm going to bring up here. But I also have to wonder in the age of DLC, how alluring are characters like Zangief and Dhalsim in terms of DLC? Like, are they better to have on the launch roster because, yeah, you want to see them, but like, do you want to pay extra or go out of your way to get them on your roster after the fact? They might not have as big of an appeal to as big of an audience. Now, they have their fans, and their fans are going to appreciate it. But when you're talking about widespread, it's like, there might be flashier other characters like Akuma. He's in like most of the games, but he's not always on the launch roster. Sometimes he comes in a season later, an update later, a DLC pack later, and because they know that people will be excited and almost for sure take my money when it comes to
Yeah.
Akuma. So
He's a hidden character, so him being added as a DLC character, it just makes a ton of sense. Like he's supposed to pop out, when everyone's kind of done fighting the tournament, and take his cheap shots on everyone and all that kind of stuff.
damn
'Cause
money
that's
in
what
the
Akuma
bank
players
kind
do.
of guy, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a
But yeah,
WWE
well said.
reference for those of you that that didn't get it. Money in the Bank.
Mm. But anyway, there's definitely a distinction that should be made between what is a good DLC character and what's a good kind of launch roster character.
Mhm.
And if you have certain archetypes that are not filled at all with your launch roster, that's a bad thing. So in my opinion, after Dhalsim, I think that you take a step down in terms of how likely the rest of the characters I have on the list are. But the Street Fighter 2 boss characters are oftentimes pretty heavily seen in these games. It's worth noting that Bison doesn't show up at all in Street Fighter 3. And he's been killed about 1,000,000 times in these games. But he's also in nearly every damn game and in the launch rosters for those titles pretty much no matter what. Balrog and Vega are also in very similar situations. And with the exception of Street Fighter V, Sagat has appeared in a ton of launch rosters as well, including the original Alpha games. Like he's just kind of a character you expect to have in there. So Street Fighter V really broke the mold with that. And honestly, I think that was kind of a mistake because of how iconic of a character he is. He's really kind of your ideal launch roster character, in my opinion. And I hope Capcom doesn't repeat that mistake and just basically includes them this next time around. But again, the 4 Shadowloo bosses are kind of like, you might not have one in there. Maybe, we've talked about Balrog being DLC. I don't know, maybe it's Vega. It does make sense to maybe not have all 4 of them in there, but they're more often than not in these games.
So I think I'm trying to keep track here. That makes 9. Ryu, Chun, Luke. Oh, sorry, 10 because Ken.
10.
Ryu, Chun, Luke,
Yes.
Ken, Sim, Geef, Bison, Balrog, Vega,
We'll have a
and
graphic
Sagat.
up here. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, cool.
That, you can't see it, but everyone else can. So.
Future,
Sorry about
yeah.
that.
But so I'm also wondering though, and wondering how much you took this specifically into consideration when coming up with this list. That if things are aimed for around the time of alpha, do you think the alpha characters have a bigger chance of making this initial roster?
That is definitely a consideration, yes. And again, anyone from the Street Fighter 2 era and stuff like those are just such iconic IPs. But are those DLC? Are all those base roster kind of stuff? And to avoid the mistakes of Marvel Infinite, it's really important that your launch roster has that big impact, right? So moving on here, there's another hopping off point after the boss characters, and I think you can make a case for these fighters being DLC, as we just talked about, as well as base ones, but there are just a handful of standouts here. But Rose is likely a candidate for the launch roster because of her heavy ties to the storyline. She's the only person I know who can time travel, and I didn't even freaking know she could do that until recently. Shoutouts to hidden powers that are game changers, but that are just randomly revealed in story mode, right? But Street Fighter 6 is supposed to have some Back to the Future stuff going on. She's the only character who can apparently do it, so it makes sense for her to be in there. But next up is Cammy and Sakura. They have also found themselves as fairly popular characters over the years, where they're played extremely actively in the competitive scene, but also by casual players too. Like a lot of people will pick up Cammy and Sakura and play them pretty heavily. So they make a lot of sense to me. And I would also throw Karen in there because I know when she was announced by Capcom for Street Fighter 5, like the development team was talking to us about it, and they're like, there's a lot of hype and momentum here at Capcom for this character. We love this character. We fought hard to get her kind of back in here. And the thing about Karen is she is extremely well thought of in the competitive scene, and she's actually popular with casuals too. And it's like, man, that was a home run of a character. That is rare for Capcom to re-release a character like Karen and have her have that much impact. And so like, I'm like, man, if you're really hoping to, like, it makes a case for her for DLC as well, but like if she's on the launch roster again, it's like, yeah, that's Karen. She's alpha. She's right there. Like there's a really good reason to have her in the game again. So yeah.
So that's 14, I think, so far. And
Yeah,
just,
that's 14.
did you have a certain number that you think would be good for
I
a launch
did.
roster? Or did you not
Yeah.
want to reveal that yet? I'm sorry,
It's
am I jumping
actually
the gun?
20. No. We'll go right into it. It's actually 20 characters, but one of the things I want to mention about that, because there's only 2 characters left, but you say 20 and we're at 14. Well, the thing about it is with Street Fighter 4 and Street Fighter 5, Capcom added 4 new launch characters to the cast. In Street Fighter 4, that was Rufus, El Fuerte, C. Viper, and Abel. In Street Fighter 5, it was Laura, Rashid, Nikali, and Fong. I think they're going to add another 4 here. And so that gets a little bit like, so now we're up to 18. There's 2 last characters here. And yeah, it's, you could count Luke in there. I don't know if you would or not, because he's going to be in Street Fighter 5, it could get a little bit dicey, but it's very rare for Capcom not to do brand new characters because of what they talked about, like with Capcom Fighting Evolution and other things, is if you don't have new things in the game, and this is a direct quote from Capcom, people feel like it's just a rehash of what you've previously done. And Capcom's one of the most notorious rehash companies in video games, where, they really feel like, and so I don't think it's a mistake Capcom is going to ever do again, where they don't have brand new characters. And it just makes sense. It's like, you do want, some characters out there that really show off the gameplay, like, are what your game can do, like Elena, even in Street Fighter 3, like her bracelets were all different colors, and that was some kind of like thing with the CPS3 arcade board that Capcom made, where doing that level of detail and colors and palette swaps or whatever to make that happen was a technical achievement, and so it just makes sense to do some new iterations here every time out. So I firmly believe that 4 of the roster spots are going to be to brand new characters, and good luck calling those. So might as well.
Right.
So.
Well, and then they also present opportunity to fill in some of the spots here. Like so far, we only have 1 grappling character, and it's like, do you want only 1? Maybe you want 2? Maybe you want 3 on the launch roster or 20? Oh, who knows? But they can also go into filling in some of those gaps.
Yes. So there's a few very obvious standouts left on the board, like Guile and Akuma, but there were, very few complaints about those characters being released as DLC in Street Fighter V. And since that worked out so well, why not save those characters again for that approach? So yeah, it's, Guile's blonde. We already talked about how big of a deal that is, all this kind of stuff. But again, since we're going back to the past via time travel, I can actually see someone like Nash once again being on the launch roster.
Yeah.
He's kind of a really good pick. He hasn't quite explored his full tale. We've talked a bit about Byron Taylor, who I almost even hate saying his name. No offense to the voice actors or anyone who does a role with him. I hate his character design with a passion. But
it was just
I think
the
Nash
thought of having him on the roster, because that was the speculation for a while, is maybe he's going to be a character that joins the actual fight. And no one was like, oh, sweet. It's like, he just looks like a super generic, kind of military guy with a scar.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of scarred us, no pun intended.
Yeah. The lame dancing is what got me. But anyway,
Oh, right.
So Nash is number 15, and my final last pick, and John's going to kind of hate me for this one, but I do have is Fei Long.
I was
And
going to say
Fei
Fei Long. I was hoping you would say Fei Long.
He's actually voiced by Matthew Mercer of Critical Role, the Dungeon Master on Critical Role, and that's actually one of the hotter IPs right now. And Mercer is actually a really big fan of fighting games. If he's listening to this, hey, shout out to Matt. Love the show. And getting him back in studio to record some lines for this character would just be a really slick way of bringing him back, because you've got one of the biggest, Twitch, people right now coming back into your game. You can make Fei Long a pretty important part of stuff. Like Bruce Lee is freaking awesome. Fei Long's cool, all that kind of stuff like it. And he might fit the very footsie and calculated play we're hoping Street Fighter 6 kind of gravitates more towards, right? And Fei Long is, he's got some big detractors out there, but his style of play is very tried and true in the Street Fighter history, right? And the way he plays, the very fundamental footsies, all that kind of stuff, like there's a really good spot for him, and I think it would be a good time to bring him back. And there's my 16. So
you don't see G as like coming back with Rose or something like that to be a bad guy, given where he's at right now.
I think he's a perfect DLC character, like him or Q or something like that. Like bring him back in some regard to that. But I mean, again, it's you start going into characters like Gil and other stuff, and I think those are more likely for a DLC expansion. But it just depends on like what way they go. A few honorable mention, of course, like Goken. We've talked about Gotetsu. We've talked about a lot of other characters. It's going to make a lot of sense to bring some of these characters back. Again, Chun-Li's dad. I mean, you could even go to the Street Fighter 1 characters like with Geki, and an Eagle and stuff like that, and bring those characters in. But there's a lot there that they can have fun with. But I tried to go with like the most likely people I thought it would be.
Yeah, so looks in here like 11 Street Fighter 2 characters, but they are some of the most iconic too. I think you can, if I'm marketing here, I think you want to launch with an awesome roster, a big grand opening that everyone can appreciate. But we did learn that you could put like the likes of Balrog and Guile, and like you said, Sagat, who was a few seasons too late. I don't know if he needs to be on the launch roster, but I think if you have a strong launch roster, and then you can have some of those almost have to be there, not like Ryu Chun-Li status, but I think even Ken, you could put him in as season 1 DLC. Just like, it's kind of like, yeah, the party's not quite all here yet, but they're getting here, and there's 20 characters, but then the next batch of 6 or however many more, you bring in some just like almost non-negotiables, like, yeah, they're here too, come on, bring them in. Akuma, Sagat, Ken, Guile, and people that would keep the hype for your game still close to that grand opening feel for like a full season or a year. And then you can still have some like big splashes, like, oh, and here's Jury, and and anyone else that's been reasonably successful in the past, some newcomers too, and such like that. But that might be the way I would do it if it were me to call the shots here, based on what we've seen so far.
Yeah, there it is. It's and we're hoping, again, like the last 2 games have been about 16 characters launch roster. We're hoping that Capcom ups that a little bit, goes more to about 20, 24. That seems about a better sweet spot in this modern era, especially when you have games like Smash Ultimate that launched with 1 million characters. You gotta kind of be aware.
Everyone's
of that.
pissed at Nintendo, like, man, you're the gas station in town that dropped your prices like all the way down to 30 cents or something like that, making all of us have to deal with that now.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, then there was Marvel Infinite. So, I mean, you've got to really look at the launch roster and make sure that people, for their $60, they're getting a good value. And so you can't just put all these characters behind a paywall. That's no dice. But again, save some people for hyping it up, kind of thing. Like, just make sure that initial launch roster is pretty high impact. And I think with these characters, it would be pretty good. You've got some mainstays. You have to have Ryu, Chun-Li, and all that kind of stuff, and a few others. Like, you have to have some of those Street Fighter 2 characters. You can't get by without a handful of those. But some of the alpha characters, some of the other ones, like, that starts to make some sense there, and it's like, okay, yeah, have some fun with it at that point. But just don't cheap out on like the major IP characters that people expect to be there. Like, that was a horrible thing. And it, like, for example, someone like Ken is not there, I'm gonna be pretty pissed. I'm gonna be like, what are you doing? Like, that's people just expect to have Ken available from day one, and I expect to rage at all the Ken players from day one too, because that's how that works. Because
it's how the relationship works. Yeah.
Exactly. It's all about meeting expectations there, John. But anyway, speaking
Who's
of
going to
meeting
wake up DPS and get us to feel like we're truly playing a Street Fighter game online if we don't have Ken day one?
That's exactly it.